close your eyes. Let the world fall away. Tonight, we're traveling back more than 3,000 years, not to witness a simple war, but to stand at the edge of something far greater. A story that has echoed through every generation since it was first sung. A tale of rage and grief, of glory and loss, of a man who had to choose between a long, quiet life and a brief, blazing one. This is the story of the Iliad, and at its burning heart stands Achilles, the greatest warrior the world would ever know, and perhaps the most human hero ever crafted in words. If these stories of mythology help you relax, you would be helping me tremendously by liking the video and subscribing. So thank you. Before we dive into blood-soaked beaches and divine interventions, let's understand what we're about to experience. The Iliad isn't just an old poem gathering dust in libraries, it's one of the foundational pillars of Western literature, composed sometime in the 8th century before the Common Era by a poet we call Homer. Whether Homer was one person, many people, or even a tradition rather than a man, we may never truly know. What we do know is that this epic changed everything that came after it. The Iliad is massive, sprawling across 24 books and containing over 15,000 lines of dactylic hexameter, a rhythmic meter that would have been sung or chanted by performers called rhapsodies at festivals and gatherings throughout ancient Greece. Imagine firelight dancing on stone walls, hundreds of people gathered in rapt silence as a single voice brings gods and heroes to life, night after night. The poem wasn't meant to be read silently from a page. It was meant to be heard, felt, experienced with your entire body. Here's something crucial to understand. The Iliad doesn't tell the entire story of the Trojan War. That 10-year conflict, sparked by love or lust, depending on who's telling it, began long before the poem opens and ends, long after it closes. The Iliad focuses on just 50 fouls of morn, days during the 10th and final year of the siege. It doesn't show us the war's beginning. It doesn't show us the famous Trojan horse or the fall of Troy. It doesn't even show us Achilles' death, though it hangs over every line like a shadow. What it does show us is something more intimate and more devastating. It shows us rage. It shows us what happens when pride collides with fate, when personal honor demands a price that entire armies must pay. The opening line tells us everything we need to know. Sing, goddess, the anger of Peleus' son Achilles. Not his courage, not his victories, his anger, his rage, that furious, world-ending wrath that will drive the entire narrative forward, like a chariot racing toward a cliff. And from that first word, we're plunged into a world where gods walk among mortals, where honor is worth more than life, and where every choice carries consequences that ripple across generations. But before we can understand Achilles' rage, we need to understand Achilles himself. We need to go back further, back to before the ships gathered at Aulis, back to before Helen's face launched those famous 1,000 vessels, back to a prophecy and a frightened mother who knew her son was destined for tragedy. The story begins not with a man, but with a goddess, Thetis, a sea nymph, one of the 50 daughters of the ancient sea god Nereus. She was, by all accounts, breathtakingly beautiful, so beautiful that she caught the attention of Zeus himself, king of the gods, and Poseidon, lord of the seas. Both divine powers pursued her, each determined to make her his bride. But then came a prophecy, delivered by Themis, the Titaness of divine lore, and order, a warning that would change everything. The prophecy stated that any son born to Thetis would grow to be greater than his father, greater in power, in strength, in glory. Think about that for a moment. If Zeus, already the most powerful being in existence, fathered a child with Thetis, that child would one day surpass him. Another overthrow, another cycle of divine violence, another king of the gods cast down by his own offspring. Zeus had overthrown his father Cronus. Cronus had overthrown his father Uranus. The pattern was clear, and Zeus, for all his flaws, was no fool. So the gods made a decision. Thetis would marry a mortal, a human king named Peleus, ruler of the Myrmidons in the region of Phthia in Thessaly. This way, even if her son became greater than his father, he would only surpass a mortal man. He would pose no threat to the order of Olympus. Thetis was not consulted about this arrangement. In some versions, she resisted fiercely, using her divine power to shapeshift into fire, water, a lion, a serpent, anything to escape Peleus's grasp. But the gods had decided, and what the gods decide tends to happen, whether you like it or not. The wedding of Thetis and Peleus was one of the greatest celebrations in mythological history. It took place on Mount Pelion, and every god and goddess was invited. Every single one except Eris, the goddess of discord and strife. Now you might think excluding the literal embodiment of chaos from your wedding would be a smart move. You would be wrong. Eris arrived anyway, uninvited and furious, carrying a golden apple. Not just any apple. This one was inscribed with 3 simple words that would doom thousands. For the fairest. She threw it into the midst of the celebration, where it landed among the gathered goddesses. Immediately, 3 of the most powerful immortals claimed it. Hera, queen of the gods, and Zeus's wife. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war. And Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Each one absolutely certain that she deserved the title of fairest. Zeus, wisely refusing to judge between his wife, his daughter, and his aunt, delegated the decision to a mortal, a Trojan prince named Paris. But we'll return to him soon. First, we need to see what became of Thetis and Peleus's son. The child was born and named Achilles. From the moment of his birth, Thetis knew what awaited him. She had received a prophecy, terrible and absolute. Her son would have 2 possible fates. He could stay home, live a long, peaceful life, grow old surrounded by family, and eventually die forgotten, his name fading into obscurity within a generation or 2. Or he could go to war at Troy, achieve immortal glory, earn fame that would echo through all of history, and die young, very young. Thetis, like any mother, wanted her child to live. She tried everything in her power to protect him, to cheat fate itself. In the most famous version of the story, when Achilles was still an infant, Thetis carried him to the river Styx, the boundary between the living world and the underworld. She held him by the heel and dipped him into those black, supernatural waters. Everywhere the water touched, his skin became invulnerable. No blade could pierce it, no weapon could harm it. But the heel, the small patch of skin where her fingers gripped him, that remained mortal. That remained vulnerable. Other versions say she tried to burn away his mortality with fire, anointing him with ambrosia, the food of the gods, and placing him in flames to sear away the mortal parts of his nature. But Peleus caught her in the act, horrified, and she fled back to the sea, abandoning both husband and son in her rage and shame. However it happened, the result was the same. Achilles was almost invulnerable. Almost. And that small exception would eventually kill him. With Thetis gone, Peleus needed someone to raise and train the boy. He chose Chiron, the wise centaur who lived on Mount Pelion. Chiron was different from other centaurs, those wild, drunken creatures known for violence and chaos. He was civilized, learned, gentle. He had taught other heroes, Heracles, Jason, Asclepius the healer. Under Chiron's guidance, Achilles learned everything a hero needed to know. How to hunt, how to fight with spear and sword, how to ride, how to survive in the wilderness. But he also learned music, playing the lyre with the same intensity he would later bring to battle. He learned medicine, the art of healing wounds. He learned to be more than just a killer. He learned to be fully human. His closest companion during these years was Patroclus, another boy sent to Chiron for training. Patroclus was older, gentler, less naturally gifted than Achilles, but possessing a kind heart and steady wisdom. The two became inseparable, more than friends, companions in the deepest sense, each one completing something in the other. Achilles was swift, brilliant, almost inhuman in his abilities. Patroclus was patient, thoughtful, human in all the best ways. They would grow up together on that mountain, unaware that their bond would one day become the fulcrum on which the entire Trojan War would turn. As Achilles approached manhood, Thetis returned. She had heard whispers among the gods. War was coming. The Greeks would sail for Troy, and they would need heroes. They would need Achilles, and if he went, he would die there. The prophecy was clear, so Thetis did what any desperate mother might do. She hid him. She took him to the island of Skyros, to the court of King Lycomedes, and disguised him as a girl, hiding him among the king's daughters. There, dressed in women's clothing, going by the name Pyrrha, which meant the red-haired one. Achilles waited while the world began to tear itself apart. He didn't wait long. The Greeks were gathering their forces, and prophecy stated they could not take Troy without Achilles. A clever man named Odysseus, king of Ithaca and trickster extraordinaire, came to Skyros. He suspected the truth, so he arrived disguised as a merchant, laying out fine cloth, jewelry, perfumes, all the things young women might want. But among the luxuries, he placed a shield and a spear. When the daughters of Lycomedes gathered around his wares, most reached for the jewelry. Achilles reached for the weapons. His nature betrayed him. His training overwhelmed his disguise. And Odysseus smiled. The game was up. Achilles could no longer hide. The choice was before him, naked and unavoidable. Stay on Skyros, live a long life with Deidamia, the king's daughter with whom he had fallen in love and who was already pregnant with his son. Grow old, be forgotten, or go to Troy, fight in the greatest war the world had ever seen, earn glory that would never die, and fall in battle young. We know which path he chose. We're here because of it. But understanding that choice, understanding what it meant to him and what it cost, that's what the Iliad is really about. Not just rage, but the terrible weight of knowing your own death is coming and walking toward it anyway, because the alternative is worse than death. It's invisibility, it's meaninglessness. For Achilles, that was no choice at all. Seeds of war. Now we need to understand how this war began, because it didn't start with politics or resources or territory, though those things mattered. It started, as so many disasters do, with beauty, vanity, and wounded pride. It started with that golden apple at a wedding, with 3 goddesses and 1 foolish prince. Remember Paris, the Trojan prince chosen to judge which goddess deserved the title of fairest. His story begins even before that moment, shrouded in prophecy like Achilles' own tale. Paris was born to King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy. But before his birth, Hecuba had a terrible dream. She dreamed she gave birth not to a child, but to a flaming torch that set all of Troy ablaze. The seers interpreted this as an omen. The child would bring destruction to the city. So when Paris was born, Priam ordered him to be taken to Mount Ida and left to die of exposure. A shepherd found the infant and raised him as his own. Paris grew up tending flocks, unaware of his royal blood, living a simple life far from the great city he would one day help destroy. It was here, on the slopes of Mount Ida, that Hermes appeared to him, leading 3 radiant goddesses. Zeus had chosen Paris as judge in the divine beauty contest, perhaps as a cruel joke, perhaps because fate had marked him for this role. The goddesses stood before the young shepherd, and each one offered him a bribe if he would choose her. Hera, queen of the gods, offered him power. She would make him ruler of all Europe and Asia, the most powerful king in the world. Imagine that. Unlimited political dominion, armies at your command, entire nations bowing before you. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, offered him skill in battle. She would make him the greatest warrior ever to live, invincible in combat, remembered forever for his victories on the battlefield, strategic genius, military glory, the kind of fame that never dies. And Aphrodite, goddess of love, offered him the most beautiful woman in the world as his wife, Helen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus and Leda, whose beauty was already legendary, whose face, as the saying would later go, would launch 1,000 ships. Paris chose Aphrodite. He chose love or lust or desire, depending on your interpretation. He chose the most beautiful woman in the world. There was just one small problem. Helen was already married. She was the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta, and through a strange twist of fate, nearly every major Greek leader had sworn an oath to protect that marriage. You see, when Helen came of age, every prince and king in Greece wanted to marry her. She was that beautiful, and her father, the mortal king Tyndareus, Leda's husband, was terrified of what would happen when he chose one suitor and rejected all the others. The rejected men might band together and attack him. So Odysseus, always the cleverest man in any room, suggested a solution. Make every suitor swear an oath to defend Helen's marriage, whoever she married, against anyone who might threaten it. In exchange for this oath, each suitor would be allowed to pursue one of Helen's cousins, spreading the alliance even wider. The suitors agreed. They all swore the oath. Helen chose Menelaus, and everyone went home, thinking the matter was settled. They forgot about prophecy. They forgot about golden apples and wounded goddesses and shepherds chosen to judge divine beauty contests. They forgot that some deaths take years to come due. Paris, now aware of his true identity and restored to his position as Prince of Troy, traveled to Sparta on a diplomatic mission. Menelaus welcomed him, offered him hospitality, the sacred guest right that was inviolable in ancient Greece. And then Menelaus left on a journey to Crete, leaving Helen alone with a handsome Trojan prince. What happened next depends on which version you hear. Did Paris seduce Helen? Did he abduct her by force? Did Aphrodite's power compel her to fall in love with him? removing all choice from the equation? Or did Helen, trapped in a marriage she never truly wanted, see an opportunity and take it? The ancient sources disagree. Some portray Helen as a victim, stolen away against her will. Others suggest she went willingly, even eagerly, abandoning her daughter Hermione and her husband for a chance at passion with a younger, more exciting man. The truth, as is so often the case, probably lies somewhere in between. Aphrodite had promised Paris the most beautiful woman. Aphrodite, goddess of desire, had power over mortal hearts. But Helen was still human, still capable of choice, still responsible for her actions. However it happened, Paris and Helen fled to Troy together, taking much of Menelaus's treasure with them. When Menelaus returned to find his wife and his gold gone, his rage shook the foundations of his palace. He went immediately to his brother, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, the most powerful ruler in Greece. And Agamemnon began to call in that oath. He sent messengers to every king and prince who had sworn to defend Helen's marriage, to Odysseus in Ithaca, who tried to fake madness to avoid going, to Ajax on Salamis, to Diomedes in Argos, to Nestor in Pylos, the old man who had fought with heroes of previous generations, and to Achilles in Phthia, the young man whose mother had tried so hard to keep him home. The fleet gathered at Aulis on the eastern coast of Greece. Over 1,000 ships carrying tens of thousands of warriors, the largest military force ever assembled. But before they could sail, the winds died. They sat becalmed, day after day, supplies dwindling, men growing restless. The seer Calchas revealed the problem. Agamemnon had offended the goddess Artemis by boasting about a deer he had killed in her sacred grove. She demanded a price for the winds to blow again. She demanded Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia, as a sacrifice. Agamemnon, faced with the choice between his daughter and his ambition, chose ambition. He sent for Iphigenia under the pretense of marrying her to Achilles. When she arrived, he sacrificed her on the altar. In some versions, Artemis took pity at the last moment and replaced the girl with a deer, spiriting Iphigenia away to serve as her priestess. In others, the knife fell and the girl died, and Agamemnon's wife Clytemnestra never forgave him, a wound that would fester for years until it finally killed him. But the winds blew, the fleet sailed, and 1,000 ships descended on Troy like a storm made of wood and bronze and rage. For 9 years, the Greeks besieged the city. They couldn't breach its massive walls built by the gods themselves, according to legend. So they pillaged the surrounding areas, sacking smaller towns, taking plunder, capturing women and wealth. It was brutal, grinding, exhausting work. Men died of disease and minor wounds. Heroes won glory in skirmishes and raids. But the war was stalemated, neither side able to deliver a finishing blow. And then, in the 10th year, during a raid on a town called Chrysae, the Greeks captured a young woman named Chryseis. She was beautiful, and Agamemnon claimed her as his prize. But her father, Chryses, was a priest of Apollo. He came to the Greek camp, offered a fortune in ransom for his daughter's return. Agamemnon refused, insulted him, sent him away empty-handed, and Chryses prayed to Apollo. He begged the god to punish the Greeks for this dishonor. Apollo heard, Apollo answered. And the real story of the Iliad, the story of Achilles' rage, was about to begin. Apollo came down from Olympus like nightfall, his silver bow strung, his quiver full of plague arrows. For 9 days he walked through the Greek camp, invisible, untouchable, shooting his divine arrows into men and mules alike. The sickness spread like wildfire. Men fell burning with fever, their skin erupting in sores, their lungs filling with fluid. They died gasping, confused, calling for gods who wouldn't answer and mothers who couldn't help. The funeral pyres burned constantly, filling the air with greasy black smoke and the sweet sick smell of burning flesh. On the 10th day, Achilles called an assembly, not Agamemnon, who as commander should have taken that initiative. Achilles, the goddess Hera, who favored the Greeks, had whispered to him that the plague was divine punishment. So Achilles stood before the gathered army and called for Calchas, the seer, to divine the cause of Apollo's anger. Calchas knew the truth, but he was terrified to speak it, because the truth implicated the most powerful man in the Greek army. So he asked Achilles for protection first, for a promise that even if his prophecy angered kings, Achilles would defend him. And Achilles, in his pride and his power, swore that oath. As long as he lived, he said, no one would harm Calchas, not while Achilles drew breath. Thus protected, Calchas spoke. The plague came from Apollo, punishment for Agamemnon's treatment of Chryses. The only way to end it was to return Chryseis to her father, without ransom, with full honors, and to offer a sacred sacrifice to Apollo. The army murmured in agreement. It was obvious, necessary, the only path forward. But Agamemnon rose, his face dark with rage, and everything changed. Agamemnon agreed to give up Chryses. He had no choice, but he would not do it without compensation. He was the commander of all Greek forces. He would not be seen to lose his war prize without receiving another. And he made it very clear, if he had to give up his prize, someone else would give him theirs. His eyes, when he said this, were fixed on Achilles. On Briseis, the woman Achilles had claimed from another raid, whom Achilles valued greatly. The threat was naked and unmistakable. Achilles exploded. He called Agamemnon a coward, a man who sat safely in his tent while others fought and died, who grew rich on spoils he never earned through his own prowess. He called him shameless, greedy, unfit to lead. The insults flew like spears, and the entire army sat frozen, watching their greatest warrior and their commander tear each other apart with words. Agamemnon shot back. He called Achilles arrogant, a man too proud of his own strength, too dismissive of authority, and then he made it explicit. Yes, he would take Briseis. He would come to Achilles' tent himself and take her, just to show Achilles who truly held power in this army. Achilles' hand went to his sword. The massive blade, the one he'd used to kill so many Trojans, began to slide from its sheath. His eyes were wild, murderous. In another second, he would have lunged across that assembly, would have split Agamemnon's skull like kindling. Consequences be damned. The war would have ended right there, not with Troy's fall, but with the Greek alliance dissolving in blood and chaos. But then Athena appeared. Visible only to Achilles, she grabbed him by his long hair, pulled his head back. She spoke to him, her voice urgent. "Don't kill him," she said. "Not now. Yes, Agamemnon is wrong. Yes, he's insulting you. But if you kill him, you'll destroy everything. The alliance will shatter. The war will end. You'll never have your glory. Swallow your rage, for now." She promised him that if he restrained himself, greater honors would come. Threefold repayment for this insult. Just don't draw that sword. Don't let your anger make you stupid. Achilles, trembling with barely controlled fury, let the sword slide back into its sheath. But his words did not soften. He told Agamemnon that he was done. He would not fight for him anymore. Let the Trojans slaughter the Greeks. Let Hector burn their ships. Achilles would sit in his tent and watch it happen. And when Agamemnon came begging, when the army was broken and desperate, Achilles would remember this moment. He would remember being dishonored, his prize stolen, his value ignored, and he would do nothing to help. Agamemnon dismissed the threat. He had other warriors. He didn't need one arrogant youth, no matter how skilled. He sent heralds to Achilles' tent that very day to take Briseis. The heralds came trembling, terrified of Achilles' wrath, but Achilles treated them gently. This wasn't their fault. They were just following orders. He let them take Briseis without resistance, though his heart was breaking, though rage was boiling in his chest like lava. As they led her away, as she looked back at him with tears streaming down her face, something in Achilles fractured. Not just anger, something deeper, something that would poison everything that followed. After they left, Achilles walked down to the shore, away from the camp, and wept. Great, wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. He called out to his mother across the waves, and Thetis rose from the depths like morning mist, silver and sad. She held her son while he cried, while he poured out his rage and humiliation. And then he asked her for something terrible. He asked her to go to Zeus, to remind the king of the gods of the favor she had once done him, to ask Zeus to give victory to the Trojans, to make the Greeks suffer without Achilles, to make them lose, to make them bleed, to make them realize just how much they needed him. Only when they were desperate, only when Agamemnon was broken and humiliated, only then would Achilles consider returning. Thetis agreed. She loved her son more than she loved Greece, more than she cared about mortal wars. She went to Olympus, found Zeus on his throne, and made her request. Zeus was reluctant. His wife Hera favored the Greeks. This would cause problems. But he owed Thetis a debt, and gods pay their debts. He nodded his head, the gesture that could not be taken back, that bound even the king of the gods to his word. He would give the Trojans victory. He would let the Greeks suffer. And Achilles would sit in his tent and watch. War without Achilles. The next day, the armies clashed again, and everything was different. Without Achilles and his fearsome Myrmidons, the Greeks lost their edge. Hector, Prince of Troy and their greatest warrior, led his forces with renewed confidence. Where Achilles fought like a force of nature, inhuman and unstoppable, Hector fought like a man defending his home, his wife, his infant son, his elderly parents. That made him dangerous in a different way. He fought with purpose beyond glory. The battles raged day after day. Heroes rose and fell on both sides. Paris and Menelaus faced each other in single combat. Helen's husband against her lover. But Aphrodite spirited Paris away before Menelaus could kill him. The gods themselves began to take sides, appearing on the battlefield to aid their favorites. Athena helped the Greeks. Apollo and Ares supported Troy. At one point, Diomedes, one of the younger Greek heroes, went on a rampage so fierce he even wounded Ares himself, driving the war god from the field, bleeding and howling. But without Achilles, the Greeks couldn't break through. They couldn't push the Trojans back to their walls. Slowly, steadily, the tide began to turn. Hector rallied the Trojans, led them in a massive counterattack. They drove the Greeks back from the plain, back toward the beach, back toward their ships. The Greeks built a wall and dug a defensive trench, desperate measures to protect their only means of escape. But even that wasn't enough. Zeus, keeping his promise to Thetis, sent a dream to Agamemnon, a false dream promising victory if he attacked immediately. Agamemnon, desperate and proud, believed it. He led the army out to battle, and they were slaughtered. The Trojans, emboldened by divine favor, fought like men possessed. They pushed the Greeks all the way back to their fortifications. They broke through the wall. They reached the ships. Fire. That was the terror that drove men mad. The Greeks had dragged their ships onto the beach, hundreds of them, their only way home. If the Trojans burned those ships, the Greeks were stranded. They would die here, on this foreign shore, their bones left to rot far from home. No proper burial, no journey to the underworld, just carrion for dogs and birds. Every Greek warrior's nightmare. Nestor, the oldest and wisest of the Greek leaders, recognized the crisis. He had seen enough war to know when a tide had turned irrevocably. He went to Agamemnon with a proposal. Swallow your pride, apologize to Achilles, give him back Briseis, give him treasure beyond measure, give him 7 citadels to rule, your own daughter in marriage, anything he wants. Just get him back in this fight. Because without Achilles, they were all going to die. Agamemnon, finally understanding the depth of his mistake, agreed. He offered a staggering amount of compensation: 20 bronze tripods, 7 cities, horses, gold, slave women, his own daughter as a bride, and Briseis returned untouched with an oath that he had never slept with her. It was more than generous. It was an abject apology disguised as magnanimity. Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix, Achilles' old tutor, were sent to his tent to deliver the offer and convince him to return. They found Achilles playing his lyre, singing songs of heroes' deeds to Patroclus. The two men sat together in the firelight, and there was a peace about them that hadn't existed in the Greek camp for days. When Odysseus explained Agamemnon's offer, laying out the treasure, the honors, the cities, Achilles listened. And then he said no. Not just no. He explained, with a clarity that shocked them, exactly what he felt. Agamemnon had dishonored him publicly. The gifts meant nothing. They couldn't restore what had been taken. It wasn't about Briseis anymore. Not really. It was about being treated like his life, his effort, his endless risk-taking meant nothing. Other men sat in their tents while he fought. Other men grew rich while he bled. And when he objected, when he dared to assert his own value, he was humiliated for it. More than that, Achilles questioned the entire enterprise. Why were they even here? For Helen? For Agamemnon's pride? Men died every day for a woman most of them had never met, for a cause that benefited only the powerful. His mother had told him his fate. If he stayed, he would die here. His name would live forever, but he would never see home again. Or he could leave, sail home to Phthia, live a long life, marry, have children, grow old. Was glory really worth trading all of that? Right now, it didn't seem like it was. The ambassadors left shaken. Ajax, the huge warrior who rarely spoke, muttered that Achilles was being unreasonable, that he'd gone too far into his own anger. But they had no answer for him, no way to compel him to return. And as they walked back through the camp, as they delivered the news to Agamemnon that Achilles refused even this massive offer, something settled over the Greek forces like a funeral shroud. Despair. The fighting continued. Hector pushed harder. The Greeks fell back further. Men died whose names we'll never know, whose stories were swallowed by the great story. Foot soldiers, spear carriers, boys too young to grow beards, old veterans who'd fought in other wars, hoping this would be their last. They fell like wheat before the scythe, and the ships burned closer with every passing hour. Patroclus watched from Achilles' tent. He saw the wounded being carried back. He heard the screams, the clash of bronze on bronze, the terrible sounds of men dying, and it tore at him. These were his people too. Greeks, comrades, men he'd trained with, laughed with, shared meals and stories with for years. They were dying, and Achilles, the one man who could save them, sat beside him playing music as if the world wasn't burning. Patroclus's fatal choice, Patroclus, couldn't stand it anymore. While Achilles brooded, Patroclus went to see the wounded. He found Nestor in his tent, tending to an injured man, and the old king seized the opportunity. He pulled Patroclus aside and spoke to him with the urgency of someone who understood exactly how desperate things had become. "If Achilles won't fight," he said, "maybe you can. Maybe if you wore his armor, if the Trojans thought Achilles had returned, they would fall back. Even the illusion of Achilles might be enough to break their advance, to save the ships." The idea took root in Patroclus's mind like a seed in fertile soil. He returned to Achilles with tears in his eyes, describing the devastation, the friends lying wounded and dying, the ships about to burn. He begged Achilles to return to the fight, or if he wouldn't, to at least let Patroclus borrow his armor. Let Patroclus lead the Myrmidons into battle. Let him pretend to be Achilles, just long enough to turn the tide. Achilles' face was conflicted. He saw his beloved friend in tears. He heard the battle raging, heard his people dying. Part of him wanted to fight, to do what he did best, to feel the rush of combat and the satisfaction of victory. But his pride, his rage, his sense of having been wronged, all of it held him back. He couldn't bend. He couldn't give Agamemnon the satisfaction. But maybe he could compromise. He agreed. Patroclus could wear the armor, the legendary bronze that everyone recognized, the helmet with its horsehair plume, the greaves and breastplate, the great shield, all except the spear, that massive ashwood spear, the one Chiron had given to Peleus at his wedding, the one only Achilles was strong enough to wield. That stayed with Achilles. But the rest Patroclus could take. He could lead the Myrmidons. He could save the ships. But Achilles gave him a warning, a crucial, specific warning that Patroclus would remember too late. "Drive them back from the ships," he said. "Save our people. But don't pursue them. Don't chase them all the way to Troy. Don't let the glory of battle go to your head. Just push them back, then return. That's all. Nothing more." Patroclus agreed. He took the armor, heavy and magnificent, and felt its power settle over him like a mantle of divinity. The Myrmidons, seeing their leader's armor, roared with joy. They'd been sitting idle, forced to watch their friends die, while their commander sulked. Now, finally, they could fight. They formed up behind Patroclus, shields locked, spears ready, and marched toward the battle like an answer to a prayer. When the Trojans saw Achilles' distinctive armor approaching, terror shot through their ranks like lightning. Achilles, the man-killer, the storm in human form. Many had seen friends, brothers, fathers fall to his spear. His very name was a curse, a promise of death. They began to fall back, their advance faltering, their courage evaporating. The Greeks, seeing salvation arrive, rallied and pushed forward with renewed strength. Patroclus fought brilliantly. He led from the front, spear flashing, shield deflecting blows that would have killed lesser men. He saved the ships. He drove the Trojans back across the plain. And the battle, which had been a rout in Troy's favor, suddenly balanced on a knife's edge. Men who had been running to escape now stood and fought. The tide had turned. But Patroclus, in the heat of battle, in the glory of it all, forgot Achilles' warning. Or maybe he ignored it. Maybe he thought he could do more. Maybe he thought he could end the war right here, right now, if he just pushed a little further. He chased the Trojans all the way to the walls of Troy itself. He tried to scale those god-built walls, tried to breach them 3 times. And 3 times Apollo himself, invisible and terrible, pushed him back. The god spoke to him then, his voice like thunder in Patroclus's head. "Stop. This is not for you. It is not fated for the city to fall to you, nor even to Achilles. Turn back." But Patroclus, drunk on battle lust, on the feeling of invincibility that armor gave him, didn't listen. He charged again. He killed Sarpedon, a son of Zeus himself, king of Lycia, and one of Troy's greatest allies. Beneath the battle over Sarpedon's body was fierce and horrible. Men fighting like animals over the corpse, trying to claim the armor, to defile or protect the body. Zeus watched his own son die and could do nothing. Even the king of the gods was bound by fate, but he could avenge Sarpedon. He could make sure Patroclus paid for this kill, and he sent Apollo to ensure it. Apollo descended to the battlefield in divine glory, too bright to look at directly. He found Patroclus surrounded by Trojan soldiers. In the chaos of combat, the god struck Patroclus from behind, a blow so powerful it knocked the helmet from his head, shattered his spear, snapped the straps on his shield. It stunned him, left him reeling, defenseless. A Trojan named Euphorbus, seeing his chance, stabbed Patroclus in the back with a spear, then quickly retreated, not wanting to face even a wounded Achilles. Patroclus, bleeding, struggling to stay upright, tried to retreat to the Greek lines. But Hector saw him. Hector, brave and doomed, who had feared to face Achilles, but now saw only an enemy warrior staggering, vulnerable. Hector charged forward and drove his spear into Patroclus's belly, just above the groin, angling up into the vitals. The bronze tore through muscle and organs, and Patroclus fell, his strength pouring out of him with his blood. As he lay dying, Patroclus spoke his last words, a prophecy born from the edge of death. He told Hector not to boast too much. The armor, the glory, it wasn't Hector's victory alone. Apollo had stripped him of his defenses. Euphorbus had wounded him first. Hector was merely the third to kill him. And more than that, Patroclus said, "You don't have long to live. Death stands beside you. Achilles will kill you soon." Hector scoffed at the prophecy, even as a chill ran down his spine. He planted his foot on Patroclus's chest and pulled his spear free. The body crumpled to the dust. Hector stripped off the magnificent armor, Achilles' armor, and put it on himself. It fit him like it had been made for his body. In that moment, wearing the armor of the greatest Greek warrior, standing over the corpse of Achilles' beloved companion, Hector reached his peak, the highest point of his glory. And from here, there was nowhere to go but down. The battle over Patroclus's body was even more vicious than the fight over Sarpedon. The Greeks were desperate to retrieve their fallen hero. The Trojans wanted to desecrate it, to drag it back to Troy as a trophy. Ajax and Menelaus fought like lions to protect the corpse, cutting down anyone who got close. The fighting raged for hours, the dust thick enough to choke on, the ground slick with blood. Antilochus, one of the younger Greek warriors, ran through the fighting to bring the news to Achilles. He reached the tent and found Achilles already anxious, staring toward the battlefield, sensing something terrible had happened. When Antilochus spoke the words, when he said Patroclus was dead, that Hector had killed him and taken the armor, Achilles didn't believe it, couldn't believe it. This couldn't be real. Patroclus couldn't be gone. But then the details came, the circumstances, the bodies still being fought over, and something inside Achilles didn't just break. It shattered into pieces so small they could never be reassembled. He collapsed to the ground, tearing at his hair, pouring ashes over his head, screaming a sound that was barely human. The servants tried to restrain him, terrified he would harm himself. Antilochus held his hands, afraid Achilles would cut his own throat in his grief. Thetis heard her son's anguish from the depths of the sea. She rose with her sister nymphs and found Achilles destroyed, ruined by loss. He told her everything, that Patroclus was dead, that he had sent him into battle, that he had failed to protect him, that it was his fault, his pride, his rage, his stubborn refusal to bend. It had killed the one person in the world he loved most. And now he would kill Hector. He would have his revenge even if it cost him his own life, because the prophecy was clear. After Hector died, Achilles would die soon after. But he didn't care. Without Patroclus, life held no meaning anyway. Thetis wept for her son, knowing this was the choice he was making. The short, glorious life instead of the long, obscure one. But she didn't try to stop him. How could she? Instead, she promised to bring him new armor. He couldn't fight Hector wearing nothing, and his own armor was on Hector's back, taken from Patroclus's corpse. She would go to Hephaestus, the smith god, and have him forge something magnificent, something worthy of Achilles' final days. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the Greeks were losing the fight for Patroclus's body. The Trojans were overwhelming them, driving them back. In desperation, Menelaus sent another runner to Achilles, begging him to show himself, to scare the Trojans, even if he couldn't fight yet. So Achilles, still unarmed, still covered in the ashes of his grief, walked to the edge of the Greek fortifications, and Athena, invisible beside him, threw a golden mist around his shoulders, crowned him with flames. She made him terrible to behold. Achilles opened his mouth and screamed. Not words, just pure, inarticulate rage and anguish. The sound echoed across the battlefield like a war horn blown by gods. 3 times he screamed, and 3 times the Trojans who heard it fell into panic. Some dropped their weapons and ran. Others froze in place, paralyzed by terror. Horses reared and threw their riders. In the chaos, the Greeks managed to pull back, carrying Patroclus's body with them, protecting it from desecration. That night, Achilles held Patroclus's corpse and wept until he had no tears left. He swore oaths over the body. He would not bury his friend until Hector was dead. He would not cut his hair until he had avenged this murder. He would drag Hector's corpse behind his chariot. He would feed Trojan captives to the funeral pyre. He would do things, terrible things, to honor this death. And far away on Olympus, Thetis begged Hephaestus to make armor for her son. The smith god, remembering how Thetis had once saved him when his mother threw him from Olympus, agreed. He worked through the night in his bronze workshop, creating a masterpiece, a helmet, a breastplate, greaves for the legs, and a shield. Not just any shield, a shield decorated with the entire world, cities at peace and at war, farmers harvesting, weddings and funerals, the ocean and the sky and the stars, all of human life captured in metal and artistry. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever made, and it was armor for a dead man walking, for a hero with less than 2 weeks to live. When Thetis brought the armor to Achilles at dawn, he took it without a word. He put it on, piece by piece, and it fit him perfectly, as if Hephaestus had measured not his body, but his soul. The Myrmidons watched in awe as their leader stood before them, shining like a god, transformed by grief into something beyond human. He was no longer the proud young warrior who had argued with Agamemnon about prizes. He was vengeance incarnate. He was death on 2 legs, and Hector's final hours had begun. The assembly gathered at dawn, every Greek warrior present, sensing that something had fundamentally changed. Achilles stood before them in his new divine armor, and when he spoke, his voice was different, harder, colder. He announced that his quarrel with Agamemnon was over, not because he'd forgiven him, not because gifts had swayed him, but because none of it mattered anymore. Patroclus was dead, and only Trojan blood would satisfy that debt. Agamemnon could keep his cities, his daughters, his treasure. Achilles wanted one thing: Hector's life. Agamemnon, for his part, tried to save face. He blamed his earlier actions on Ate, divine delusion sent by Zeus, claiming the gods had clouded his judgment. It was a politician's excuse, shifting blame to the supernatural. But he also brought forth all the gifts he'd promised: the tripods, the gold, the horses. And Briseis returned untouched, her eyes red from weeping when she saw Patroclus's body. She had cared for him, maybe even loved him like a brother. Now he was gone, and she was a prize handed back and forth between men as if her feelings were less than dust. But Achilles barely looked at the gifts. He wanted to attack immediately, to rush into battle while his rage was hot and sharp. Odysseus, ever practical, intervened. The men needed to eat first. They needed strength for what was coming. You can't fight on an empty stomach, no matter how great your grief. Achilles refused food for himself. He swore he wouldn't eat or drink until Patroclus was avenged. But he let the others take their meal. He would wait. Not long, but long enough. As the army prepared, Achilles' divine horses, Xanthus and Balius, immortal gifts from Poseidon, stood, harnessed to his chariot. These were no ordinary animals. They had wept when Patroclus died, real tears streaming down their faces, their heads bowed in mourning. Hera, queen of the gods, briefly gave Xanthus the power of speech, and the horse spoke to his master. He told Achilles that yes, they would carry him safely today, but a day was coming soon when they could not save him. Apollo and a mortal man would kill him. His death was near. Achilles already knew. He had always known from the moment his mother told him the prophecy. But hearing it confirmed, hearing it from the mouth of his own horse, it settled over him like a shroud. He didn't care. Let death come. Let it find him covered in Trojan blood. The armies met on the plain, like 2 storms colliding. But this time, the Greeks had their greatest weapon back, and he was beyond anything they'd seen before. Achilles tore through the Trojan lines like a shark through a school of fish. He killed men so quickly there was no time for boasts or formal duels. Spear through the throat, sword through the belly, trampled under chariot wheels. Bodies fell so thick the ground disappeared beneath them. The dust rose in choking clouds, mixed with blood, until you couldn't tell earth from gore. He drove them back toward the river Scamander, the Xanthus, as the gods called it. The Trojans tried to cross, to escape, but Achilles followed them into the water, and the river began to fill with corpses, arms and legs tangled in the reeds. Blood stained the clear water dark red. Bodies floated and sank and piled up until the river itself became angry. The river god rose up in fury, his waters churning, crashing over Achilles in massive waves, trying to drown him, to wash him away. How dare this mortal fill his streams with death? How dare he pollute sacred waters with this slaughter? Achilles, caught in the divine current, struggled to keep his footing as the river tried to overwhelm him. He would have drowned there, would have died ingloriously in muddy water instead of in glorious combat. But Hera intervened. She sent Hephaestus, and the smith god set the plains on fire. The flames roared across the grass, boiled the river water, burned the corpses Achilles had left scattered everywhere. The heat was so intense, the river god himself screamed and retreated, promising to leave Achilles alone. The fire god and the river god fighting over a single mortal man. That's how far beyond normal Achilles had gone. But while Achilles massacred their forces, the Trojans themselves retreated to their city. King Priam, watching from the walls, saw his people fleeing in terror and ordered the gates opened. The survivors poured through in a panicked mob, and the great gates swung shut behind them just as Achilles reached the walls. All except one man stayed outside. Hector, the defender of Troy, the man who had killed Patroclus. He stood alone before the Scaean gates, waiting for Achilles to come. His father Priam stood on the walls above and begged him to come inside. His mother Hecuba tore her robes and pleaded with him not to face Achilles in single combat. "Don't do this," they cried. "You're our son. You're Troy's hope. If you die, the city dies with you. Come inside. Let the walls protect you." But Hector stood his ground. He couldn't run. He couldn't hide behind walls while his people died because of his choices. He had led the attack on the ships. He had killed Patroclus. This was his fight, his responsibility. To run now would be cowardice worse than death. So he stayed, even though his knees trembled, even though his heart hammered in his chest, even though he knew deep in his bones that he was about to die. The duel of fates. Achilles came around the corner of the wall like a comet falling to earth. In his new armor, he blazed in the sunlight, the bronze so bright it hurt to look at directly. The horsehair plume on his helmet streamed behind him. The massive spear, the one only he could wield, was poised in his hand. His eyes, when he saw Hector, held no mercy, no warrior's respect, just murder, cold, purposeful murder. Hector broke when he actually saw Achilles charging toward him. When the reality of what he was facing hit him, his courage failed. He ran, not into the city. The gates were closed, and opening them would let Achilles in. He ran along the wall, around the city, and Achilles chased him. 3 times they circled the walls of Troy, hunter and prey, with all of Troy watching from above, weeping and screaming, and all the Greeks watching from the plain below, cheering and howling. The gods watched too. Zeus held up his golden scales, weighing the fates of both men. On one side, Achilles' life, on the other, Hector's. Hector's side sank down, down, down toward Hades. His doom was sealed. Apollo, who had protected Hector throughout the war, sadly withdrew. There was nothing more he could do. Fate had spoken. Athena, seeing her moment, descended to the battlefield disguised as Deiphobus, Hector's beloved brother. She appeared beside Hector as he ran, told him not to run anymore. Together, she said, the two of them could stand against Achilles. "Fight alongside me, brother," she said. And Hector, desperate, exhausted, relieved not to face this alone, stopped running. He turned to face Achilles. He thought his brother stood beside him. He was wrong. Achilles stopped his chase, standing perhaps 20 paces from Hector. For a moment, the two greatest warriors of the war faced each other in silence. Hector tried to speak, tried to make an agreement. "Whoever won this duel," he said, "let them treat the loser's body with respect. Let them return it for proper burial. Let this death be honorable at least." Achilles cut him off. No agreements, no honor. Lions don't make pacts with men. Wolves don't negotiate with lambs. "I'm going to kill you," he said. "I'm going to strip your armor. I'm going to let dogs eat your corpse. There will be no mercy, no respect. You killed Patroclus. For that, you die badly." Hector threw first, his spear flying straight and true toward Achilles' chest. But Athena, invisible, deflected it with a gentle breath of wind. The spear passed harmlessly over Achilles' shoulder. Hector reached for another spear, turned to ask his brother for his, and found no one there. Just empty space. Deiphobus had vanished. In that moment, Hector understood. He'd been tricked. The gods had abandoned him. This duel had only one possible ending, and it was written in the stars. He drew his sword. Achilles charged, his spear aimed at Hector's throat. Hector managed to dodge, barely, the bronze scraping past his neck instead of punching through it. Achilles' spear buried itself in the ground behind Hector, but Athena, still invisible, picked it up and handed it back to Achilles. Divine intervention, subtle and decisive. Hector didn't see it happen. He only knew that Achilles was armed again, and he was facing him with nothing but a sword. Hector rushed forward, trying to get inside Achilles' spear range, to use his sword where it might matter. But Achilles was studying him, looking at Hector's body the way a butcher examines a carcass, looking for the weakness, the vulnerable spot. Hector was wearing Achilles' old armor, taken from Patroclus' corpse. Achilles knew that armor intimately, knew every gap, every weak point in the bronze plates. And there, at the collarbone where the helmet met the breastplate, there was a small opening. The perfect target. Achilles drove his spear through that gap with surgical precision. The bronze point went through Hector's throat, just missing the windpipe so he could still speak, still breathe just enough to know he was dying. Hector fell to his knees, the spear still in him, blood pouring down his chest. He tried to say something, to ask again for his body to be returned, to beg for mercy for his corpse, if not for his life. But Achilles had no mercy left in him. "Dogs and birds will eat you," Achilles said, standing over the dying man. "I wish I could bring myself to eat you raw. That's how much I hate you. Your father could offer me your weight in gold 20 times over, and I still wouldn't give you back. Your mother will never hold you. You'll rot in the sun." With his last breath, Hector prophesied one final time. "Paris and Apollo," he whispered, "will kill you at the Scaean gates soon." His eyes closed. The greatest defender of Troy was dead. Achilles stripped the armor from Hector's body, his old armor that Hector had taken from Patroclus. The other Greeks rushed forward, gathering around to stab the corpse. as if Hector might somehow return to life and resume fighting. They mocked him, insulted him, dishonored him. He seemed softer now than when he'd been setting their ships on fire, they said. Then Achilles did something that shocked even men hardened by 9 years of war. He cut slits in the tendons behind Hector's ankles, threaded leather straps through them, and tied the body to his chariot. He mounted up, whipped his horses, and dragged Hector's corpse behind him, face down in the dust, back toward the Greek camp. Hector's head, that noble head, bounced and rolled in the dirt. His long dark hair, which his wife Andromache had lovingly combed, became matted with blood and dust. The armor clanged and scraped along the stones. On the walls of Troy, Hector's parents screamed. His wife Andromache, who had been weaving at her loom, heard the cries and ran to the walls. When she saw her husband's body being dragged away, she fainted, the veil falling from her head, the sign of her marriage now meaningless. Their infant son Astyanax, still too young to understand that his father was dead, that his city was doomed, that he himself would soon be thrown from these walls by Greek soldiers, played quietly nearby. Everything Hector had fought for, everything he'd died to protect, would be ash and blood within days. But he would never know it. The greatest of the Trojans, the man who had held back the Greeks for 10 years, was being dragged through the dust like a dead dog. From rage to redemption, Achilles brought Hector's body back to the Greek camp and left it in the dirt in front of Patroclus's bier. He built an enormous funeral pyre for his beloved friend, wood stacked higher than a house. He laid Patroclus's body on top, dressed in the finest clothes. Then he did something that horrified even the Greeks. He brought 12 young Trojan prisoners, boys and young men they'd captured in raids, and he slit their throats one by one. Their blood soaked into the ground around the pyre, human sacrifice to honor the dead. It was ancient, barbaric, and absolutely sincere. Achilles was beyond civilization now, beyond law or custom. He was operating on pure grief. He cut a lock of his own hair, the hair he'd been growing since childhood, meant as an offering to the river god of his homeland. He placed it in Patroclus's hands. Then he lit the pyre. The flames roared into the sky, so hot and high that the gods on Olympus could see them. The Greeks kept it burning through the night, pouring libations of wine and honey. Achilles didn't sleep. He lay beside the pyre, speaking to Patroclus's spirit, promising him vengeance, promising him honor, promising him companionship, even in death. When dawn came and the fire had burned down to embers, they collected Patroclus's bones, washed them in wine, and placed them in a golden urn. They built a tomb over them, a barrow that could be seen for miles. And then Achilles organized funeral games in Patroclus's honor. Chariot races, wrestling, boxing, archery contests, prizes for the winners. It was a show of respect, but also a distraction, a way to fill the enormous hollow that Patroclus's death had carved into the heart of the camp. But Hector's body still lay in the dust. And every morning for the next 12 days, Achilles would harness his horses, tie Hector's corpse to his chariot, and drag it 3 times around Patroclus's tomb, dragging it until the features should have been obliterated, until the flesh should have been stripped to bone. Except Apollo wouldn't allow it. The god, in pity for Hector, who had always honored him, protected the body from corruption, kept the skin intact, kept the dignity of death, even as Achilles tried to destroy it. On Olympus, the gods argued, Most of them felt Achilles had gone too far. Hector deserved burial. Hector had been pious, had always given the gods their due. This desecration offended them. Apollo was the most vocal. Achilles has no shame, he said, no sense of proportion. Many men lose people they love. Brothers, sons, they grieve, they bury them, they move on. But Achilles makes his grief into a weapon against the dead, against a man who can't defend himself anymore. It's ugly, it's impious, and it needs to stop. Zeus agreed. He called Thetis to Olympus and told her to go to her son. Tell him, Zeus said, that the gods are angry with him, that this treatment of Hector's body must end. Priam will come to ransom his son. Achilles must accept the ransom and return the body. This is not a request, this is the will of Zeus. Thetis, recognizing an order when she heard one, descended to the Greek camp and delivered the message. Achilles, after 12 days of drowning in his rage and grief, finally nodded. He would obey. He would let Hector go. Meanwhile, Zeus sent Iris to Troy with a message for Priam. Go to the Greek camp, she told the old king. Go alone with a herald. Bring treasure as ransom. Hermes will guide you and protect you. Achilles will not harm you. Bring your son home. Priam's wife, Hecuba, begged him not to go. It was madness, she said. Achilles was a beast who'd killed so many of their sons. He would kill Priam too. But Priam was beyond caring about his own life. His son, his best son, lay unburied while his spirit wandered lost. If there was any chance at all to bring Hector home, Priam would take it, even if it cost him his life. He loaded a wagon with treasure, 12 beautiful robes, 12 cloaks, 10 bars of gold, gleaming tripods, cauldrons, and a magnificent golden cup. A fortune, more than enough to buy back a body. Then, as night fell, he and a single herald drove out of Troy, through the darkness, toward the Greek camp. His family wept as they watched him go, certain they would never see him again. Hermes met them on the road, disguised as a young Myrmidon soldier. He guided them through the Greek sentries, casting a charm that made anyone who looked at them fall asleep. He led them directly to Achilles' tent, then vanished. Priam and his herald stood outside, the old king trembling, knowing that inside was the man who had killed his son, who had dragged his corpse in the dust, who had every reason to kill him too. Priam entered alone. Achilles was sitting at his table, just finishing his evening meal, Patroclus' armor hanging on the wall behind him like a ghost. When Achilles looked up and saw the old man, he was too surprised to react. Priam crossed the tent, fell to his knees, and did something unthinkable. He kissed Achilles' hands, those terrible, blood-stained hands that had killed his son and so many others. He kissed them and began to speak. "Think of your own father," Priam said, his voice breaking. "Peleus, who is my age, who sits in his hall waiting for news of you, who prays to see you return home safely. I had 50 sons, Achilles. 50. And you've killed so many of them. But Hector was the best, the noblest. And I've come here, to this place, to beg the man who killed him, to kiss the hands that spilled his blood, because he deserves to come home. Please, let me take my son home." Achilles stared at the old man, and something in him cracked. Not broke, cracked, letting light in for the first time in days. He saw his own father in Priam's face, saw Peleus, old and alone in Phthia, waiting for a son who would never return home. He thought of Patroclus, who should have been buried by now, who should be at peace. And he thought of Hector, a good man fighting for his home, now lying in the dirt because of choices everyone had made, because of gods and apples and Helen and pride and rage and all of it, all the stupid, pointless reasons that men kill each other and break families and leave old fathers weeping. He began to weep. Not the harsh, angry sobs from when he learned of Patroclus's death. Quieter tears, tears for his father, who would never see him again, for Patroclus, who was gone, for Priam, who had buried so many sons, for Hector, who had fought bravely and died badly. For all of it, the waste, the sorrow, the things that could never be unmade. Priam wept too, and for a long moment the two men, enemy and enemy, shared their grief in the quiet of that tent. Then Achilles gently helped Priam to his feet. He ordered his men to wash Hector's body, to anoint it with oil, to wrap it in the finest cloth. He did this out of Priam's sight, not wanting the old man to see his son's corpse and lose his composure, afraid that if Priam became angry or accusatory, Achilles might kill him in a renewed burst of rage. His self-control was still fragile, his emotions raw and dangerous. When the body was prepared, Achilles himself lifted it onto the wagon. He swore to Priam that the body would go unmolested, that he would personally command the Greeks not to fight for 12 days so that Troy could hold proper funeral rites. Priam thanked him with real gratitude. They shared a meal together then, the old king and the young warrior. They marveled at each other. Priam saw Achilles' beauty, his godlike form, and understood why he was so feared. Achilles saw Priam's dignity, his nobility, and understood what it meant to be a true king, a true father. After the meal, Achilles had a bed prepared for Priam and his herald in the forecourt of the tent, so that if any Greek officers came to visit, they wouldn't see the king of Troy and cause trouble. Before Priam slept, he asked Achilles to wake him before dawn. He needed to leave while it was still dark, while most of the camp still slept. He didn't want to be recognized, didn't want to risk anything going wrong now that he had his son back. Achilles agreed and woke him in the small hours of the morning. Hermes appeared again to guide them safely through the camp and back to Troy. When Priam's wagon rolled through the gates of Troy at dawn with Hector's body, the entire city poured into the streets. The wailing that rose from those walls could be heard all the way to the Greek camp. Hector's wife Andromache threw herself on the corpse, cradling his head, stroking his hair. His mother Hecuba wept until she had no voice left. Even Helen, the woman whose beauty had started this war, mourned him. Hector had always been kind to her, she said, had always defended her when others blamed her, had always treated her with respect. Now he was gone, and she had no friend left in Troy. They built a funeral pyre in the center of the city, stacked it high with wood, and laid Hector on top dressed in his finest robes. For 9 days they gathered wood from the mountains under the truce Achilles had granted. On the 10th day they lit the pyre. All of Troy watched as the flames consumed their greatest defender. They collected his bones, washed them in wine, and placed them in a golden urn wrapped in purple cloth. They buried the urn and built a stone tomb over it, then held a funeral feast in the palace. And with that feast, the Iliad ends, not with Troy's fall, not with Achilles' death, not with the Greeks sailing home or Odysseus trapped on his 10-year journey. It ends with Hector's funeral, with the honoring of a good man, with Achilles having transformed from a creature of pure rage into something resembling human again. The war would continue. Troy would fall, Achilles would die. But those stories belong to other poems. The Iliad, the song of Achilles' wrath, ends when that wrath finally lets go. When rage gives way to grief, and grief gives way to something like understanding, legacy, and meaning. The Iliad ends, but the story doesn't. We know what comes next because other ancient poems, now mostly lost, except for fragments and summaries, told those parts of the tale. Let me walk you through the aftermath, the way these stories echoed through the ages. Paris, perhaps guided by Apollo, perhaps simply lucky, shot an arrow that struck Achilles in his famous vulnerable heel. That one small spot where Thetis's fingers had held him. The poison spread through his body, and the greatest warrior who ever lived fell, not to a better fighter, but to a coward with a bow. Ajax and Odysseus fought desperately to recover his body, to keep the Trojans from desecrating it the way Achilles had desecrated Hector. They succeeded, barely. Achilles was buried with full honors, his ashes mixed with Patroclus's in that golden urn, just as Patroclus's ghost had asked, together in death as they had been in life. A great barrow marked their tomb, visible from the sea, so that sailors for generations to come would know this was where heroes rested. Odysseus and Ajax both claimed Achilles' magnificent armor as prize for recovering the body. When the Greek leaders voted to award it to Odysseus, Ajax was driven mad with fury. He tried to kill the Greek leaders in the night, but Athena afflicted him with madness, making him see the Greek livestock as the men he wanted to murder. He slaughtered sheep and cattle, thinking they were Agamemnon and Odysseus. When dawn came and he realized what he'd done, the shame was too great. He drove his sword into the ground and fell upon it, taking his own life. Another casualty of pride and competition, even as the war neared its end. Troy fell, finally, through Odysseus's cunning. The sow, famous Trojan horse, that massive wooden construction, hollow and filled with Greek warriors. The Trojans, thinking the Greeks had sailed away and left it as an offering to Athena, dragged it through their gates, despite warnings from the prophet Cassandra and the priest Laocoon. That night, the warriors emerged from the horse, opened the gates, and the Greek army, which had only pretended to leave, poured into the sleeping city. The slaughter was absolute. King Priam was murdered at the altar where he sought sanctuary. Hector's infant son Astyanax was thrown from the walls, killed so he could never grow up to avenge his father. Hector's wife Andromache was taken as a slave by Achilles' son Neoptolemus. Helen was retrieved, though whether she returned to Menelaus willingly or as a prisoner depends on which version you read. The Greeks won. They destroyed Troy so thoroughly that its location was lost for millennia, until archaeologists rediscovered it in the 19th century. But the victory was hollow, cursed even. Many of the Greek heroes never made it home. Storms scattered their fleets. Agamemnon returned to Mycenae only to be murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, who had never forgiven him for sacrificing their daughter. Odysseus wandered for 10 years, encountering monsters and gods and magic before finally reaching Ithaca. Most of the others simply vanished from history, their names remembered only because they had gone to Troy and died there or shortly after. But why does this story still matter? Why, 3,000 years later, are we still talking about Achilles and Hector, about rage and grief, about the choices men make and the prices they pay? Because the Iliad isn't really about a war. It's about being human in a world that doesn't make sense, about loving people who will die, about choosing between a long, quiet life and a short, meaningful one, about pride and anger and whether honor is worth anything at all. Achilles is fascinating because he's so deeply flawed. He's arrogant, violent, capable of shocking cruelty. But he's also passionate, loyal, honest about his feelings in a way that would have seemed strange to ancient Greeks and still seems strange to many people today. When he grieves, he doesn't hide it or suppress it. He falls apart completely. When he loves Patroclus, that love is the most important thing in his world. When he finally shows mercy to Priam, it's not because he's been convinced by arguments, but because he's reached a point where his own humanity reasserts itself. He's larger than life, but never inhuman. That's what makes him great. Hector, by contrast, is the most human hero in the entire epic. He's not the strongest fighter. He's not divinely favored like Achilles. He fights because he has to, because his city needs him, because his family depends on him. There's a scene earlier in the Iliad, before Patroclus dies, where Hector goes home to see his wife and infant son. He reaches out to hold the baby, but the child cries in terror because he doesn't recognize his father behind that huge horsehair-plumed helmet. So Hector takes off the helmet, laughs, and holds his son. It's one of the most tender moments in all of Greek literature. This is a man who would rather be with his family than fighting, but he fights anyway because someone has to. And he dies because of it, because he made the choice to stand outside the gates, because he chose duty over survival. The poem asks us to care about both men, to see the tragedy in Hector's death and the tragedy in Achilles' grief, to understand that war destroys everyone it touches, victors and vanquished alike. Homer doesn't give us easy answers. He doesn't tell us that Achilles was right to withdraw from battle, or that he was wrong. He doesn't say war is glorious, or that it's evil. He shows us men making choices in impossible situations and dealing with the consequences. He shows us the beauty and the horror, often in the same scene. The Iliad is also fundamentally about mortality and meaning. Achilles chose a short, glorious life over a long, peaceful one. Was he right? The Greeks who first heard this poem would have said yes, absolutely. Kleos, lasting fame, was the closest thing to immortality mortals could achieve. Your body would die, but your name, your story, would live forever in songs and poems. 3,000 years later, we're still talking about Achilles. By that measure, he made the right choice. But the poem also shows us what that choice cost. He never saw his father again. He lost his beloved Patroclus. He became a monster for a time, driven by rage to do things that horrified even his own people. He achieved immortal fame, but he died in pain and grief, unfulfilled and young. And what about the people without choices? The women captured and enslaved, the children killed when cities were sacked, the unnamed soldiers who died in the dust while heroes earned glory. The Iliad doesn't forget them either. Homer gives us Andromache's grief and Hecuba's despair. He gives us Briseis mourning Patroclus. He reminds us constantly that glory has a price, and often it's paid by people who never wanted to be part of the story. Maybe that's why the Iliad endures. Not because it glorifies war, but because it refuses to look away from what war actually is. It's not a recruitment poster. It's not propaganda. It's a clear-eyed examination of violence and honor, of rage and reconciliation, of men trapped between mortality and meaning. It asks the hardest questions. What is glory worth? What does it mean to be remembered? How do we stay human when everything around us pushes us toward becoming monsters? And it doesn't always give comfortable answers. The poem also understands something profound about grief. Achilles' rage at Agamemnon, destructive as it was, pales beside his rage at Patroclus' death. That's the rage that nearly breaks the world, and the only thing that can finally soothe it is another griever. When Priam enters Achilles' tent, they don't bond over honor or political alliance. They bond over loss. Two men who have lost the people they loved most. That moment of shared humanity, enemies seeing enemy as something more than a target, is what finally allows Achilles to let go, not of his grief, that will never leave, but of his need to express it through violence. In a strange way, the Iliad is hopeful, not about war. War in the Iliad is terrible and wasteful and stupid, but it's hopeful about people, about our capacity to find meaning even in suffering, about our ability to choose how we respond even when we can't choose what happens to us, about the possibility of empathy even between enemies. Achilles and Priam will go back to being enemies after that night in the tent. The war will continue. But they had that moment, that recognition of shared humanity, and it mattered. So if you take anything from this journey through the Iliad, let it be this: the story has lasted because it tells us something true about what it means to be human, to love and lose, to rage and grieve, to make choices knowing they'll cost us, to try to find meaning in a world that often seems meaningless, to see enemies as people, to know we're going to die and choose how to live anyway. Achilles made his choice, Hector made his, Patroclus made his, and every single day, in ways large and small, we make ours too. The war is over, Troy is ash, but the questions remain. What matters most to you? What would you choose? How will you be remembered? These aren't easy questions. They weren't easy 3,000 years ago, and they aren't easy now, but they're worth asking. And the Iliad, that ancient song of rage and grief and brief glory, keeps asking them. That's why we're still listening. If this journey through ancient Greece, through divine rage and human grief, through the brutal beauty of the Iliad has resonated with you, if these old stories still speak to something in your soul, then let me know by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Good night and sleep well.